I'd like to start out today, before we go to the scriptures, and talk about the tale of two dawns. D-O-N. The tale of two dawns. All right? The first is Don Quixote. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with the story of the man of La Mancha, but confession here, I grew up, two things that was really big in our household, other than God, was politics and the theater. And I grew up going to plays and musicals, and so two of my favorites as I was growing up, there's since been some really great ones out, but two that I grew up with were Fiddler on the Roof. It's kind of a family movie. You've probably heard me talk about that one. And the other one is Man of La Mancha. And in fact, I watched it again yesterday with my son. And the basis of the story is there's a noble Italian who is reading all these books of chivalry of days gone past, King Arthur and the Round Table kind of stuff. And he goes wacky, and he begins to see himself as a knight, and he takes on the persona of Don Quixote from La Mancha. And he goes around in the modern society acting as if he is this noble knight. And so the main part of the story is Don Quixote, thinking he's a knight, comes to a regular wayside inn. It's barely a one-star stop. It is where the lowest of the low stay, and it is dirty, it is filthy, and it's anything but noble. And we're introduced to Aldonza. Aldonza is the waitress. Now, there's a little bit of sophistication in the movie to it because the role is played by Sophia Loren, and it's hard to dirty her up, but they did the best they could. And she plays this a waitress, really, at this stop. She is dirty. She smells from perspiration, as well as do all the guys that are staying there that are the traveling merchants. They are crude, rude, not the kind of guys you want your daughter anywhere near. And also, we find out that she is a woman of the night. As they advance, she only wants the one to advance with the most money. And so that is the reality of the situation. And then along comes Don Quixote, dressed in rusty old armor. And he comes into the inn. Now the innkeeper, all he sees is money. Matter of fact, he claims, he says, I love this line, he says, when did a poor person ever have time to go crazy? So obviously he's got money. And so they serve him, and when Don Quixote sees Aldonza, he does not see the reality that we were all introduced to. What he sees is a refined, beautiful lady, and he gives her a name that's fitting her station, what he sees. He gives her the name Dulcinea. Dulcinea. And he sings the praises of Dulcinea, and he says, you are going to be the lady that I do all these righteous, that I do all these wonderful deeds. It's going to be in your name, Dulcinea. Now, most of the movie, Aldonza kind of resists this picture of herself. She's teased by everybody else because of it. She is taken advantage of and hurt tremendously because of this image, and she resists it. She rejects the idea of Dulcinea, for she is Aldonza, born in a ditch, left by her mother, used by men, rejected by all, just to be forgotten. However, the climax, the end of the movie, is when Aldonza visits Don Quixote, who has had a dose of reality himself and he is shocked by it. He's on his deathbed, and he is kind of comatose, and she shows up, and he's trying to remember who she is. And at that point, she says to him, my Lord, I am your lady. I am Dulcinea. And of course, in the climax, he realizes that she is and who he is, and the hope versus the reality that we all love is kind of what's birthed out of that. But more importantly, the story ends with this character, Aldonza, not seeing herself anyway, that way, the way she used to be, in the, if you would, the real way. But she saw herself. You could see her life would change, and that she saw herself through his eyes as Dulcinea. A life was changed. Don Quixote. Now, the second Don you won't be familiar with at all, I can pretty much guarantee it. It's Don Crider, and that name should not ring a bell. Don Crider was a very small church evangelist when I was growing up. He went from Idaho and down into California. He went to small churches and did small church revivals. He never had a radio program. He never wrote a book. He never led a huge church. He was just a small town evangelist. But when I was 11 years old, my family went to one of his crusade kind of things, his preaching things. And it inspired me. It kind of reorientated my understanding that God didn't just want my belief, he wanted my life. But more importantly, the next evening we went back to hear him again because it was so good. And I got a chance to talk to Don. And he looked down at my 11-year-old self and said, Joey, I was going by Joey at the time, Joey, I see you're going to go into ministry, into vocational ministry, that God has his hand on your life. And he was able to look into this 11-year-old, up to that point, which was pretty much a follower, wasn't particularly excited necessarily about my faith or anything, wasn't really especially special about me. All the achievements that I could point to all happened kind of after this fact. But 11 years old, Don saw something in me. He saw potential. And he declared that. And we're in this series called Close Encounters. It's this whole idea of how our lives are transformed when we experience God. Today we're going to look at a close encounter with someone who God sees with different eyes than he sees himself. And by the way, he's right to see himself the way he does. The reality of the situation is a lot like Aldonza's. It's not very good. Yet God sees something else. And so this gentleman we're going to look at today, his name is Gideon. Let me give you a little bit of Gideon's backstory. You can find his story in Judges chapter 6. Let me just give you the highlights as we kind of look at him. So if you remember where we left off, God had brought this family down into Israel and through Joseph. And God then brought them out of Egypt because everybody had forgotten about Joseph, and so somebody else came along, and they enslaved the people. And then God used Moses. We talked about him last week, and Moses led the people out. He led them actually to the border of the promised land that God said that he would deliver them to, and they were like, they evaluated reality and said, no way, we won't go. And so God said, okay, I agree with you. So he waited for that generation to die off. And the next generation then entered into the promised land, the area that God said that they would have. And they began, and he established them there. He did great miracles. He established them. They were able to move in and establish themselves a country. But as soon as it kind of began to settle, as soon as they conquered it and they began to build homes, being human, they began to kind of forget who did this all for them. And the Bible simply says they began to do evil in the eyes of the Lord. And so to get their attention, God allowed a nation, actually several nations, but the largest of the nations was from Midian. So they called the Midianites. He says that he gave them over into the hands of the Midianites for 7 years. And it was so bad. What would happen is that the Israelites would raise their cattle and sheep and goats would have babies. They would raise them and they would plant their crops. And as soon as the crops were ready to be harvested, as soon as the animals were full grown, the Midianites and several other countries would come into Israel. It said they were so bad, it was like locusts. They'd come in and they would just beat on the Israelites. They wouldn't kill them because they needed the work. They would beat on the Israelites. They would take all the crops. They would take all the animals and leave. So it was kind of like they were back at slavery. It wasn't official slavery, but that's what it was like. It was so bad that it said that the Israelites were so afraid that they lived in caves and high in the mountains. They basically said, hey, where's the worst place that nobody would come and visit us? Nobody would bother us. And they began to make homes in those places. And of course, it got so miserable that they said, you know what? God, will you help us? See, what they had begun to do is they begun to worship Baal and really kind of forget about God. But now that they were in trouble, Baal couldn't do much for them. Kind of like sometimes when we get in trouble, all of a sudden we realize our 401k, our jobs, all our plan can't do anything for us. So now it's time to call on God. So this is what they do. First thing God does is he sends a prophet, and the prophet says, listen, just so we're straight here, you didn't need me. Remember I did all this miraculous stuff for you? I brought you, and you decided you don't need me. So I hear you crying out to me, but just so we're straight here, it's not that I haven't done anything. It's what you have not done. It's what you have not done, not what I've not done. And then this sets up what happens starting in verse 11, where Gideon encounters God. So I want to take a look at Gideon's encounter with God. And the interesting thing is this encounter is this kind of opposing views that we've kind of already introduced. This encounter is of opposing views. So if you have your Bible, you can turn to your Bibles in chapter 6, verse 11. It'll also be up on the screens. It's up to you. Anyhow, Judges chapter 6, starting verse 11. The angel of the Lord. Now, this is the angel of the Lord, and later on it says the Lord himself. And so let me give you a little sneak peek here, okay? This is like one of those times in the movie where the character goes through things and you know things that the character doesn't. So to Gideon, somebody just shows up. He thinks he's important, but he's not sure. He thinks he's a representative, but he's not sure. But the reader in this case, us looking into this historical account, already know it's God that he's encountering. He just doesn't know that. Are you following me? All right, back to the story. Verse 11, the angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. All right, so what we find out here, it's really quick, but it's significant. What Gideon is doing is they have grown some wheat, and it's time to harvest, which also means it's time for the Midianites to show up and take it. So normally the way that you harvest a wheat is you are out in the open, because what you want to do is you want to take, it's all kind of together, and you want to kind of throw it up in the air, and the wind comes by as it crosses, and all the light stuff, it kind of blows away, and the heavy good stuff that you can eat falls to the ground. And that's the way you normally do it. But if you're doing that out in the open, it's pretty easy for the Midianites to know what's going on and come take your food. So in a wine press is down in the ground. It's not quite like a well. It's a little bit higher than that, but there's walls around it. And so if you can kind of be down in it, and nobody can really see kind of what's going on. So Gideon is hiding in fear from the Midianites. That's the reality of the situation. He doesn't want to be seen. And here's the other thing. It tells us about his crop. If he can fit it into a wine press, there ain't much there. There's not a whole lot there. It's not going to go a long way. So he doesn't have much, and he's scared about what he does have. Then notice verse 12. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Now this is about as big a contrast as Don Quixote saying to Alonzo the prostitute, "Oh, my fair lady, Dulcinea." That in essence is how this is cold water in Gideon's face. It is the opposite of what is going on. As a matter of fact, Gideon points this out, verse 13. "But sir," Gideon replied, just in case you weren't noticing what's going on, sir, "if the Lord is with us, Why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our fathers told us about when they said, did not the Lord bring us out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and put us into the hand of the Midians. Then the first thing that Gideon addresses is, you said the Lord is with me. But here's the reality of the situation, sir. The reality is, if the Lord is with us, then how come all this bad is happening? How come I have to be in this wine press and I have a family that used to have plenty and now we're down to this little? Is that what it means for God to be with us? You've got this situation wrong. Verse 14, the Lord turned to him and said, and 14, by the way, is where it drops the angel of. And it goes right to who he's talking to, the Lord. The Lord turned to him and said, go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? Now, the interesting thing is, God doesn't defend. He doesn't redirect. He doesn't acknowledge. He just says, listen, you have enough strength to do the task that I've asked for you because it is I who am sending you. Now, this doesn't quite compute because remember, I give you a little sneak peek here. Gideon doesn't quite know who he's talking to yet. You'll see where I get that from coming up. But he goes to the second part. He says, okay, he's not going to address the first part. The second part was mighty warrior. The first part was Lord is with you. The second part is mighty warrior. He says this, verse 15. But the Lord, Gideon asked, how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. So he says, you're calling me mighty warrior, but I don't know if you know this, but there are 12 tribes in Israel. Just like there are so many states in America. And we're the least of those tribes. Nobody wants to live in this state. Nobody wants to live in my neighborhood. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, it'd be one thing if I was like the diamond in the rough in my neighborhood, right? I was the one giant that was the smartest one. But you got to understand that even in my own family, I'm considered kind of the bottom. I'm considered the least important, the least qualified, So the reality is, I don't get this, because the reality is, not only do I not feel the Lord is with me, but this whole idea of mighty warrior, you couldn't have picked a worse person. It's like calling a prostitute a fair lady. And God responds, the Lord answered, I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites together. And remember, he did the same thing with Moses. God doesn't say why. He doesn't answer his question. He doesn't let him into his mindset and say, well, what you don't know is. Doesn't falsely prop him up or anything. He just affirms what he's already said, that Gideon can do it with what he's got, because he's got God with him. Because he's got God with him. You see the opposing views here? Gideon says, here's the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation is that we're in tough times, and they don't look like they can get better. And God has abandoned us. And the reality of the situation is that I'm in the worst place you could be in life. And not only am I in the worst place you could be in life, but I'm the worst of those that are in this place in life. And God says, here's the opposing view. I'm with you, and you're a mighty warrior. Two drastically opposing views. Now, what happens is really interesting, but I think it's worth noting, because if you remember, this sounds a little bit like the conversation that God had with Moses. And remember, Moses came back really with 3 questions and 2 comments, and Moses ultimately got to his main point, which was, choose someone else. I'm not going to go. That didn't work out so well for him. And it seems like Gideon's going down the same path, but Gideon's path is actually a little bit different. Because what happens in this next section is that Gideon asks, he has a request of authentication. I got it out. Woohoo. It's different because Moses wanted to change God's mind. Gideon is trying to make sure it's God in the first place. Because this person keeps saying, I am sending you. And so I think what we're going to see here is his doubt isn't so much that God can do something. His doubt is that this person is God. Let's look at what it says, verse 17. Gideon replied, if now I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that it is really you talking to me. Remember how Moses tried to say, well, he was all about them. Gideon's just honest. I just want to make sure it's really you that's talking to me. Because anyone could say this. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you. And the Lord said, I will wait until you return. He wants to make sure he's the representative, but he also understands if it turns out you are the representative, I want to honor you. Verse 19, so Gideon went in, prepared a young goat, and from an ephah of flour he made bread without yeast. Putting the meat in a basket and its broth in a pot, he brought them out, and he offered them to him under the oak. He honors the visitor. He's not sure who he is, but if he is anywhere remotely related to who he says he is, he wants to honor him. And that's important. He doesn't wait to do this before everything's authenticated. He wants to make sure he's in the right place in case God is speaking. See, many of us, God will say something. Maybe you're listening to a message or you get a prompt in your heart and you're like, oh, maybe I should do that, but I want to make sure it's God. And you don't do anything till you know it's God. And yet here's Gideon. He says, I need this authenticated, but I'm at least going to move in that direction. I'm going to show that I'm willing in case it turns out that this really is the voice of God. Then notice what happens. The angel of the Lord said to him, verse 20, take the meat and the unleavened bread, place them on this rock, and pour out the broth upon them. You can imagine it all gets soaked, especially the bread. And Gideon did so. And with the tip of the staff that was in his hand, the angel Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread, and fire flared from the rock out of nowhere, consuming the meat and the bread. And then the angel of the Lord disappeared. It was at this point, after he honors this visitor, that Gideon receives his sign. Now notice verse 22. When Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord. See, we were told it was the angel of the Lord. He had no clue. Or if he had a clue, he didn't know. But it says at this point, when Gideon realized that it was the angel of the Lord, he exclaimed, "O sovereign Lord." In other words, sovereign means you are the one in control. It is all yours. It exists for you. O sovereign Lord, he says, I have seen the angel Lord face to face. He's scared because if you remember, Moses did the same thing. When he realized he was looking at God, he hid his face because he was afraid he was going to die. But the Lord said to him, peace, do not be afraid. You are not going to die. Now, a lot of people think, I'm not teaching you as this is gospel, because I try to say no more than the Bible says. But a lot of people think that when it says the angel of the Lord shows up, and especially with this kind of authority and power, that it's really Jesus, God in flesh. We don't know that to be true, but there's good evidence that that is what it is. And that's why he doesn't die, because it's God who's contained himself inside flesh. But the interesting thing here is what's going on here is, in Moses' case, God comes to him in a burning bush. He tells him he's on holy ground. And Moses, from the very beginning, hides his face. And then he has this conversation with a God he knows is God. And therefore, he's rebuked. Gideon, on the other hand, has this encounter. He doesn't know it's God. And he asks these questions. As soon as he finds out, though, it's God, he has a different response. Verse 24, so Gideon built an altar to the Lord there and called it, the Lord is peace. To this day it stands in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. Gideon responds in worship. And what we're going to find out here is that even though Gideon is, I don't know, most of you maybe are Most of you may be actually familiar, but some of you won't be familiar with the classic actor Don Knotts. You watch any of the old, what's the show, you guys? Andy Griffith show. Don Knotts is the shaky gun. He's not the sheriff, he's the helper, deputy. But Bonnie Fife, yes, thank you. He does several movies, and one of his best movies is when he's playing basically a guy who's afraid. His classic movies, The Ghost and Mr. Chicken. And Gideon kind of reminds me of this because he is Mr. Chicken in this. He's hiding in this wine press, and when this guy says, "O mighty warrior," or "the Lord is with you," he says, "Look, if you look at my life, I am Mr. Chicken." It doesn't add up. Now, what we find out is, right, if you've ever watched or if you ever get to watch The Ghost of Mr. Chicken, the guy is a chicken, but he also ends up to be pretty brave. And that's what we're going to find out in Gideon's story as well. But there's a process to this, and I want to take a quick look at Gideon's process. As God says, okay, here's the reality of where you're at, but there's a reality of the way I see you. And what does that process look like? The first is he asks Gideon to challenge the status quo. He asks him to challenge the status quo. And it says that later that day in the evening, God shows up to Gideon and says, "Gideon, this is what I want you to do. Your family is worshiping Baal, a false god. Your father has built an altar to Baal. And you know that's not me and that's wrong. That's sin." He says, "So Gideon, here's the first thing I want you to do. I want you to go to your father's flock or herd. He's got some bulls. I want you to take," specifically he says the second one. I'm not sure why, but he says take the second one of his good ones. "I want you to then go to your father's altar to Baal. I want you to knock that down, tear it down. I want you to build a proper altar to me and sacrifice that bull to me," which is what they should have been doing all along, worshiping God in that way. Now, this is what I love. He says it. It is dangerous to do because this isn't just his father's altar. This is the religion of the area, and probably the whole village uses this altar. I mean, this is sacrilege. And it says that Gideon's afraid, but Gideon obeys. And I think there's a theme you see all through this. Gideon's afraid, but Gideon obeys. The important point is that you don't, beat your chest. You're like, "Oh, I can do this." You got this false courage. This, we always paint this faith as in, well, God said it, so now I don't have to worry about anything. I don't have to have any negative feelings. I can just do it because God said it was true. And this is one of the reasons I love Gideon, because his knees are knocking, but he obeys. He knocks down the altar. He builds one appropriate to God. He sacrifices the bull, but he does it in the middle of the night because God wasn't specific. God wasn't specific. Now, he's not rebuked because God wasn't specific. And the next day, the village wakes up and they see this and they do this full investigation, and they find out that it's Gideon, probably one of his 10 servants that helped him, as the ones who kind of gave it away. And they come to take care of him because he, like I say, this is sacrilege. He messed. And this is where God encourages and strengthens him. First thing he does is his dad, and it was his dad's bull and his dad's altar that was built. His dad stands up and says, "Hey, you guys," he doesn't say his son did wrong. He didn't say his son didn't do it. He said, "You know what? If Baal is real, if Baal is true, then let Baal deal with Gideon." Now this father knows, even though they've been doing this ain't going to happen. But still, his dad sticks up for him. That's the first thing. And then here's the other thing. All the people are against him, right? He's torn down the Baal altar, and that's what all of Israel's doing at this time, is they're worshiping Baal. And then all of a sudden the Midianites and this grand army show up, and God says to Gideon, "Go gather an army." And all these people that were against him, all of a sudden he calls for an army. They show up. It says they show up. See how God's encouraging Gideon because he was faithful. He challenged the status quo. He challenged what everybody else was doing. I can't go to college and say I believe that God created. I look like an idiot. I can't go to my job and say, hey, you know what? This is great, but there's no way I can work every Sunday. I'm supposed to worship the Lord. I'll get fired, I'll whatever. But he challenges the status quo. And God encourages, he protects them. And here, this is the other thing I like. Gideon goes and says, okay, this army's gathering. God, I don't mind fighting them. These are my words, not his. You'll have to read them. He says, I don't mind fighting them. But once again, I just want to double check that this is your plan. So he says, I'll tell you what, God, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to set out this little piece of fleece. And what I loved is that in the morning, that is soaking wet and the ground is dry. Because it's unlikely that will happen. And sure enough, the next day, that's exactly what happened. The fleece was wet and the ground was dry. And then Gideon sees that, and then he does what my mind does this all the time. Well, let's see, the fleece is actually really absorbent, so maybe that could happen without God. I'm adding in the context here. It doesn't actually say he thought this. But what he does do is this. The context does says, he says, God, I don't want to make you mad. But could we reverse that tonight? Could you make the whole ground wet but the fleece dry? And God does it. God does it. And I think the reason I believe that God does this, and the context bears this out, is because Gideon isn't trying to get out of something. He's just trying to make sure it's God. That's it. That's his main concern. Is this really you? And if it's really God, he's in. That's why the way I think God even answers. Because I think a lot of us do that. We put out a fleece. I feel like God's made me do it, but I don't know if it's really God, so I put this out. But the truth is, if God speaks, we still just want to know his opinion. We don't take that as authoritative. And so a lot of times God doesn't move in that direction for us because we're playing games with him. But Gideon's not playing games. He's not playing games. The second step here is what I call a call to faith. And it's the same process. Gideon gathers this army, it says, and this is amazing. So we find out later in chapter 8 that the Midianites and several other countries have gathered, but the Midianites is the main army. They have at least 135,000 trained army specialists. Okay, now you got to remember they have come through several times now. For 7 times they've come through and just wiped the Israelites aside. No problem. And so Gideon, to his surprise, there are 30,000. All the tribes, all the family tribes send 30,000. Now that's pretty small against 135,000. It's a little bit, a little bit above 4 to 1, but it is their home and it's doable. But God shows up and says, I got another step in your process. Do you really trust me? He says, Gideon, this is way too many. He says 4 to 1, they're terrible odds. Because if you defeat them with 4 to 1, the Israelites are still going to think they did something. So he says, I'd like to whittle that number down. He says, I'll tell you what, just go to the troops and say, hey, if any of you are scared at all, that's cool, go home. So he does that. He's left with 10,000. 10,000. So now we're talking about almost 14 to 1. God says, terrible odds. Way too many. So I tell you what, you got 10,000 brave guys. I want to see if they're really alert. Go down to the water and have them drink. And the water's flowing. They have no cups or anything. They're really thirsty. They've been marching a long way. They come from all over. So anyone who gets down, puts his face in the water and takes a good long drink, goes home. But anyone, like a good soldier, who kind of dips his hand in, brings the water out and just laps it as quickly as he can before it all runs out of his hand. But he's alert, keep them. So it goes from 10,000 to 300. 300. Now, it's 450 to 1 are the odds. God's like, good odds. I like those odds. We're ready. We're ready. Now, this is what I love. This is the challenge. Gideon responds in faith. Gideon does what God says. You would think he'd say, God, I'm going to do what you said I'm going to do, God. But come on, give me something to work with here. But it doesn't, there's nothing in the context that suggests that he resists God on this. But God understands who Gideon is. And so Gideon doesn't ask this next time. God chooses to encourage Gideon before he enters into this fight. And so God comes to Gideon and says, Gideon, it's time. Tomorrow morning, it's time. But if you're afraid, which Gideon is, what I want you to do is grab your friend and sneak down to the edge of the Midian camp and just listen. So Gideon does. He grabs his friend and they sneak down. And they get to the edge. And they get to the edge. He overhears one soldier telling another soldier, man, he just woken up. He says, I just had a dream. He says of this huge stone rolling down into our camp and just rolling over our tents and everything. And the other guy says, he says, that means that Gideon and his army is going to demolish us. And so Gideon hears his enemies say, we believe, we're afraid. Here Gideon is scared out of his mind. And he hears his enemy, who outnumbers him 450 to 1, say, we're scared because Gideon is going to destroy us. God encourages him and strengthens him. God doesn't rebuke him for his fear. God doesn't rebuke him because he doesn't quite know what to do. See, the issue to God is faith. Do you trust me? Not do you all of a sudden, can you set your human emotions and everything aside and just kind of all of a sudden you have this confidence and nothing kind of permeates. It was one of my great heroes, I guess you could say, human heroes, John Wayne, who's quoted as saying, courage isn't being afraid, but saddling up anyways, even when you are afraid. And this is what we see with Gideon. So finally, we get to see Gideon, the mighty warrior. So as soon as this happens, the first thing, this is what I love this. The first thing that happens is Gideon goes back up and he worships God. That's the very first thing he does. He worships God. God, you are everything, all that, and then some. And then Gideon puts a plan into action. This is the interesting thing. God has called him. God has given him a couple directions, and he's encouraged him. But now it's Gideon. Now we get to see the mighty warrior. So he calls together his 300 men. 300. There's 135,000 men armed and ready to fight down in the lower valley. They fill up the valley. There's no way to sneak up on 135,000. You can sneak up on one part, but then everybody else will know by the time you get past a man or two. So they huddle up and Gideon says, okay, guys, God is with us. We can do this. He inspired. All of a sudden the leader comes out. We can do this. Why? Because God is with us. He's proclaiming this truth now. I believe God is with me, that God is with us. Now here's the plan. Everybody take a trumpet. Now they wouldn't everybody in the military, in this army, wouldn't necessarily have a trumpet. But among 30,000 originally, they would have 300 trumpets. And it said that everybody who left their gear. It actually says that. So now they have a trumpet for everyone. And then Gideon's plan, not God's plan. It doesn't say this is God's plan. Gideon's plan is, all right, here, everyone's got a trumpet. Great. Okay, throw that around your back. Now, here's a jar. It's an empty, and they didn't have clear jars, mason jars like we do. It was clay. Everyone has your torch. Okay, we don't want them to see us coming right away. So light the torch and put it over the flame. Now, we're going to all be on the peaks of the valley. We're going to surround the valley. And all I want you to do, he said, here's the instructions. You would think the instructions would be, okay, you guys flank left, and then we're going to go. No, here are the instructions. When I blow my trumpet, you blow your trumpet. And then when I break my pot, you break your pot. And then we'll just do what comes naturally. Doesn't sound like much of a plan. Doesn't sound like much of a plan at all. But that's his plan. Somehow, when he sees what God's going to do, when he sees their fear, the mighty warrior comes out, and they do that. They surround it. All of a sudden, and they're supposed to yell, and then they're supposed to charge and yell for God and for Gideon. And you might say, well, Gideon, that's kind of prideful, but it's not, because they're afraid that they actually say, the dream says Gideon is going to destroy them. So he wants them to hear the name Gideon, because that's what they're afraid of, God and Gideon. So they do. They blow their trumpets. And so you can imagine everybody's dead asleep, and all of a sudden they wake up, and there's just this huge sound around them. So they wake up, and then all of a sudden they all bust their pots, and all of a sudden these lights go on, and they're surrounded. They're in the middle of the sleep. So you know what they do? They get up, they hear this noise, they see this light, they're under attack, and they begin to, one section who doesn't know the other section, there's 135,000 of them from different countries, they begin to fight each other. They're in such a panic, they begin to fight each other. Before the 300 can get out off the tops down to the bottom, most of the army is dead. Most of the army is dead. And Gideon wins the battle. Now there's a little bit more to the story, but Gideon wins the battle. He is, God with him, the mighty warrior. Amazing, huh? About as amazing as a prostitute becoming my lady. About as amazing as a follower, average 11-year-old becoming a pastor. You and I have undiscovered potential. We have undiscovered potential. And though we often do the same thing that Gideon does initially, God, you know my family background? I didn't have a healthy family. I didn't have the support that other people. We didn't have the resources. I didn't go to college. Or if I did, I'm the one who flunked out. Or God, most of my life was wasted in a haze of drugs and alcohol. Or God, I'm just not that gifted. I can't speak as good as this person. I don't like people as much as that person. I don't have a great smile like this person. I'm just an average, or I'm below average. Everyone agrees I'm the least. I'm the least. But that's not the way God sees us. It doesn't change the way God sees you. First of all, because he designed you. He knows your potential. You don't. He does. But second of all, he's not relying on you in the first place. It's him. It's him. So you take your little potential and you add God's sovereignty, you got success. Doesn't matter what your potential is. You add it to God's sovereignty and you got success. And I would just encourage all of us, listen to the Lord, because he sees who you are and what you can be. And he is not confused. He is not at all persuaded by the past or even the current situation you're in. And maybe you're like, I've been trying, but it doesn't seem like I'm getting any traction. It doesn't seem like I'm going anywhere. And I would just encourage you, maybe you're in the process and you don't even know it. Kind of reminds me of a story of there was a young boy. It was in a day and age where boys learned their father's trade. And so his dad worked with expensive tile, furnace tile specifically. And the boy asked his dad if he could try, because he saw his dad cutting the tile, and the father said no, because the wrong cut would just ruin the expensive tile. And this belonged to somebody else, and he couldn't do that. But he said, why don't you watch, son? So he did. He watched his father draw a line on the tile with the black chalk. He would place the chisel carefully on the line and repeatedly tap with blows. First, very lightly, as he circled the tile slowly. And then, little by little, there'd be heavier blows were made. It looks to me, said the boy, like you're getting nowhere. You haven't begun to cut through. Why are you just tapping, Dad? Watch, said the father. After a number of blows carefully repeated, the father gave one hard blow and the tile separated with a perfect cut. And the boy asked what I would ask, well, why didn't you just hit it hard in the first place? And the father replied, it would have ruined the tile and made it worthless. All those earlier blows set the pattern for the final one. And many times when we're sitting still, it's because the Father's making little blows. He's chipping away. And if you trust him, that doesn't mean you can't be afraid, doesn't mean you can't be nervous, but if you trust him, he will make the final blow and you'll get to see the work he's been doing all along. May you fearfully but assuredly embrace the potential God sees in you. May you be reborn in the Spirit into his glorious plan for your life. For you, God is with you. He is in you. You are his mighty warrior. Live that way. God, may what your word spoken to us come true in our lives, not because of who we are, but because of who you are. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.